It was the bells that first disturbed me that morning, softly at first, as though reluctant to announce themselves to the waking air. Oxford's bells have always possessed a curious morality. They do not merely tell the time, they insist upon it, like a reminder from God that one has wasted another hour. I remember sitting by the window of my rooms in Jericho, the curtains half drawn, the air smelling faintly of damp wool and spent tobacco. The bells from Magdalen carried over the river, striking 8, then 9, then something else, an odd tremor in their rhythm, as though the ringer's hand had faltered. It was that hesitation, that almost imperceptible uncertainty, which stayed with me. Outside, the cobbles glistened with a thin varnish of rain. Students hurried beneath umbrellas, gowns flapping like dark wings, while the river mist climbed sluggishly towards the spires. I had intended to spend the morning reading Donne, but habitant affliction I share with most policemen led me instead to the crossword in the Times. There, in the 5th across, the clue read, "Sound heard before crime scene." 5. The answer, of course, was alarm. I smiled at the coincidence, though I could not have known how prophetic it would prove. By 10 o'clock, Lewis had arrived. He never knocked properly. He tapped once, tentatively, and then entered as though apologizing for existing. "There's been a call from the college, sir," he said. "St. Swithin's. A porter found a man in one of the stairwells. Dead, apparently." His voice carried that particular blend of reluctance and certainty that tells you the morning's routine has just been derailed. St. Swithin's lay north of Broad Street, a small and self-satisfied college where the lawns are always too perfect and the dawns too pale. The rain had ceased, leaving everything with the sheen of a watercolor still drying. As we crossed the quad, I noticed the chapel door ajar, a thin ribbon of organ music leaking into the cold. The porter met us beneath the clock tower, hat in hand, his face drawn into the solemn mask peculiar to men who spend their lives opening doors for others. "He's still there, sir. In staircase C. I thought it best not to move him." Inside, the air smelt of polish and paper. The body lay at the bottom of a narrow flight of steps, one arm bent at an unnatural angle, spectacles askew, a dark patch blooming beneath the head. Beside him, a book thin, leather-bound, its pages splayed like wings in mid-fall. I knelt beside him. There was a certain decency to death in Oxford. Even the violent ones seemed to apologize for the inconvenience. Lewis said quietly, "Looks like he fell." "Perhaps," I answered, though people rarely fall with such precision. The man was in his late 50s, dressed in a dark suit and scarf, as though he had prepared for a funeral and merely chosen his own. His shoes were polished, his hands clean. What unsettled me most was his expression not of pain, but of surprise, faintly tinged with amusement, as though death had whispered a particularly clever answer just before the bell. In the pocket of his jacket, I found a folded timetable of chapel services. One entry, circled twice in pencil, evensong, Feast of St. Swithin, and below it, faintly written in the margin, 2 words, "Change, ringing." Lewis noticed my glance. "Some kind of note, sir?" "Perhaps, or perhaps a reminder. The bells again, you see. Everything begins with bells in Oxford." We waited for the doctor, whose arrival added nothing but the usual platitudes about time of death and cranial fractures. I listened half-heartedly, my eyes drifting back to the open book beside the corpse. It was a volume of sermons, published in 1891. The ribbon marker rested at a page that read, "For none hears the bell, but he thinks of his own end." Later, standing beneath the tower, I looked up at the dark mouths of the bells. The wind shifted, and they began to move not with joy, not yet but with that uncertain quiver that precedes morning. Even now, years later, when the wind carries that same uncertain note across the city, I find myself remembering that morning, the hesitant bells, the book, the faint smile on the dead man's face. Oxford, after all, has never truly learned the difference between prayer and warning. It was late afternoon when we found him. The light had that peculiar color that belongs only to Oxford in early autumn, a pale, indecisive gold that can neither commit to warmth nor retreat into gray. The chair-well moved sluggishly beneath the willows, its surface untroubled but for the occasional circle left by a falling leaf, or the silent nose of a duck. I remember the sound of gravel under my shoes, that slight crunch that always seems louder when one approaches death. Lewis walked a few paces ahead, his hands buried in the pockets of his coat, his shoulders hunched in that patient way of his that made even the simplest of movements appear apologetic. "There's something by the bank, sir," he said, turning half towards me without stopping. A coat. And well, more than a coat. The constable stationed there pointed towards the reeds where a dark shape lay half submerged. The river, faithful as ever, had tried to return what it had borrowed. The man was face down, his hair tangled with weed, his right arm stretched out as though in belated appeal. A fisherman, perhaps, would have noticed sooner, but the water keeps its confidence. He was younger than the first man, 30, perhaps. Clean-shaven, with the pallor of someone who had spent more time among books than in daylight. His shoes were missing, his shirt torn at the collar, and there was a faint indentation around his wrist where a watch might once have been. Lewis muttered something about robbery, but I wasn't listening. The river held my attention more than the corpse. There was a rhythm in the way it pressed against the reeds, measured, persistent, like an unanswered question. A small notebook had lodged itself against a branch a few yards downstream. When I picked it up, the pages clung together, the ink running like tears across a blurred equation. The first legible words read, "Time itself may deceive." A quotation, or something of his own. I slipped it into my pocket, the water cold even through the leather of my gloves. Lewis said he'd send the body to the mortuary. He always spoke of the dead as though they were parcels to be sorted efficiently, kindly, but without attachment. I told him to wait. There was something missing here, something that resisted the simple narrative of accident or despair. The grass near the water's edge was flattened in two distinct places, not one. A second set of prints, smaller, perhaps a woman's, though the river had done its best to erase them. And in the mud so faint it might have been an imaginative pattern like the edge of a bicycle tire. I asked the porter from St. Swithin's whether any of the college bicycles were unaccounted for. He frowned, thought for a moment, then said one of the fellows, a Dr. Tennant, had mentioned his being stolen 2 nights earlier. Stolen, or borrowed perhaps. Words in Oxford have a way of softening around the edges. As the body was lifted, I noticed the man's hand clenched around something small and rigid. It took an effort to prise it open, a coin, old, heavy, bearing the worn relief of St. George and the Dragon. A commemorative sovereign, I thought. Not worth much, yet worth keeping. It was still warm from his grasp, as though some final message lingered in the metal. Back at the path, the light began to fade. The spires in the distance turned a delicate violet, and the bells, those tireless bells, began to stir again. Their sound traveled over the water, fractured by distance, returning as an echo of itself. I thought of the first man, the book of sermons, the penciled words about change ringing. And now this second body, drawn from the same river that curled like a question mark through the heart of the city. Lewis asked what I made of it. I said nothing at first. The sound of the bells reached us again, clearer now, as though answering him. Then I said quietly, only that the dead, it seems, have an inconvenient sense of timing. That night, as I sat in my room with the window open to the damp air, I took out the soaked notebook. Under the ruined pages, one phrase had survived the water. He rang for mercy. I poured a measure of whiskey, watched the surface tremble with the faint pulse of the bells, and wondered, not for the first time, whether Oxford itself had grown tired of keeping its secrets. The college seemed quieter that evening, though perhaps it was only that I was listening differently. Silence in Oxford is a layered thing. It settles upon stone and glass and thought itself, carrying the residue of centuries. St. Swithin's was no exception. Beneath its courtyards and staircases lay the faint acoustics of memory footsteps that had never quite faded, words spoken into oak panels that refused to forget. Lewis had gone home. He said he'd see to the reports in the morning, and I didn't stop him. The truth was, I preferred solitude. There are moments in an investigation when company feels like interference, as though someone were breathing too close to a candle. I wandered through the cloisters, the soles of my shoes echoing against the flagstones. The light above the quad trembled in the thin mist. Somewhere, a door closed with the careful sound of someone who did not wish to be noticed. I found myself drawn toward the chapel. The porter had told me earlier that the late Dr. Tennant, whose bicycle was missing, had been the college organist, a detail that had lodged itself in my mind. Music and death have always shared a corridor. The chapel door yielded easily. Inside, the air was heavy with the fragrance of polish and candle smoke. The organ pipes glinted faintly in the half-dark, like the ribs of a sleeping giant. At the lectern lay an open hymn book. I glanced down and saw the title of the chosen piece for those in peril on the sea. Not the most subtle of choices, I thought. The bookmark's faded ribbon of blue silk was frayed at the edges, as though fingered too often. I stood there longer than necessary, listening for something that wasn't sound at all, but rather an absence where sound should have been. The kind of silence that knows what it's hiding. When I turned to leave, I caught sight of a shadow moving behind the organ stall. A young woman stepped forward, startled, perhaps embarrassed. She was one of the college's graduate students, she said, Miss Perry, reading theology. She had known Tennant not well, but well enough. He was kind, she said, though not in ways that always helped him. Then she hesitated, and her voice thinned to a whisper. He'd been worried lately. "Letters," she said, "anonymous, about the bells." Letters. The word rang faintly against the air like a struck note. I asked what they had said, but she seemed uncertain or unwilling, only that they came on Sundays, always signed with a single word. Listen. When she had gone, I remained there, seated at the back pew. The evening light slanted through the stained glass, casting fragments of color upon the floor blue, red then blue again, as though undecided between belief and doubt. I thought of the drowned man, the missing bicycle, the book of sermons, the inscription about mercy. Fragments, all of them, yet they were beginning, faintly, to hum together. On my way out, I noticed a small brass plaque near the door, half obscured by ivy. The inscription was simple enough, in memory of those who kept the bells ringing through war and peace. I traced the letters with my thumb and wondered why the word peace felt heavier than the rest. Later, walking back through the college gardens, I heard the whispering again. It was only the wind, of course, moving through the narrow arches, carrying the scent of wet ivy and old stone. Yet there was a rhythm to it, not unlike the measured toll of bells, as though the college itself were trying, clumsily, to speak. Back in my room, I poured a drink and unfolded the drowned man's notebook once more. The ink had dried into veins across the page. Beneath the line about time deceiving, another phrase had appeared, faint but legible in the lamplight. He knows when they ring. I closed the book. Outside, the wind moved through Oxford like breath through a sleeping body. The city whispered to itself, and somewhere, deep within its lungs of stone and water, I could almost hear the bells preparing again to speak. She was sitting alone when I first saw her, third row from the front, the afternoon light falling unevenly across the empty benches, her head tilted slightly as though she was still listening to a voice that had long since stopped speaking. The lecture hall in St. Swithin's was one of those relics of Victorian earnestness, the air permanently smelling of chalk, dust, and forgotten ambition. The blackboard still bore the ghost of an equation, half erased, half remembered. I'd come there following a quiet thread of curiosity rather than instruction. The porter had mentioned that Dr. Tennant had been scheduled to give a lecture that evening, a small seminar on metaphysics and time. It had, of course, been cancelled. Yet the room wasn't empty. She turned as I entered, not startled, not even particularly surprised. It was as if she had been expecting someone, though not necessarily me. She introduced herself as Dr. Celia Harford, fellow in philosophy. Her voice was the kind one imagines emerging from the pages of a book one has never quite finished. Calm, deliberate, faintly amused at the futility of its own precision. She said she had worked with Tennant, not closely, but enough to know that he didn't believe in accidents. I told her the man by the river hadn't looked as though he believed in them either. There was a pause. Outside, the wind moved the old windows in their frames with a sighing sound, like lungs remembering their work. She asked if I was certain it was Tennant's bicycle they'd found abandoned near the towpath. I said the porter seemed to think so. She smiled faintly and said porters often think too much. Her eyes drifted to the lectern where a single sheet of paper lay, weighted down by a glass of water gone flat with disuse. I moved closer. The writing was neat, restrained, the ink beginning to fade where the nib had hesitated. A single phrase at the top. When the bell ceases, truth begins. I asked if it was his. She nodded, slowly. He'd been working on a paper. She said about the relationship between time and confession. The idea that repetition, ritual, sound, prayer can mask the truth rather than reveal it. That perhaps the constant ringing of bells was not devotion but denial. I remember thinking how Oxford excelled at that. Something in her tone unsettled me. She spoke of him with a kind of disciplined affection, neither grief nor admiration, but something between the two, like a thought too dangerous to complete. She said he had been distracted lately. There were whispers of disciplinary matters, though she doubted he cared enough for scandal. Then, after a silence that lengthened like dusk itself, she asked if I had heard the bells the night before. I told her I had. She smiled again, but it wasn't amusing this time. They rang at the wrong hour, she said. They never do that. There are moments, rare but memorable, when one feels a case tilt ever so slightly, like a painting being straightened on its hook. I looked again at the lecture notes, at the ink where the pen had pressed too hard. The phrase "truth begins" has been written twice, the first time faintly, the second time over it, darker, almost insistent. I felt then, absurdly, that I was being addressed. Not by her, not even by Tennant, but by the sentence itself. She gathered her scarf, preparing to leave. I asked, without looking up, whether she too had received any letters. Her hand paused on the fabric, the smallest tremor betraying what her words refused. "Only one," she said. It contained nothing but a line from a psalm, "He maketh the deep to boil like a pot." Then she left, her footsteps barely echoing, as though she'd rehearsed the act of vanishing. I stood there a while longer, watching the dust drift through the last slant of sunlight. The silence returned, patient and intelligent, filling the spaces where thought had been. I read the phrase again. When the bell ceases, truth begins. Outside, the bells of St. Swithin's began to ring once more, slow and deliberate, as though to prove him wrong. There is a particular hour in Oxford when even the city seems uncertain of its own existence, too late for students, too early for dawn. It was at that hour I found myself in the senior common room of St. Swithin's, staring at 2 cups of tea, both half drunk, both cooling in the quiet. The porter had unlocked the door at my request, muttering about how the fellows disliked disturbances after midnight, But curiosity, I've always believed, has seniority over decorum. The room smelled faintly of old smoke and wet tweed. Rain pressed against the windows in long, patient streaks. On the mantelpiece, a clock ticked with the solemnity of a conscience. I'd come to study the arrangement of things, and in particular, the 2 cups. They stood on a small oak table beside a pile of papers and a damp umbrella, one cup bearing the faint trace of lipstick, the other none. Dr. Tennant, it appeared, had not been alone on the evening he died. Lewis would have said as much without the theatre of inference, but for me, the deduction felt personally almost intimate. There was a stillness in that room that made me think of conversation abruptly ended, of sentences suspended in air like unclaimed luggage. The second Cupid's, rim faintly chipped, rested on a ring of moisture that had begun to dry unevenly, suggesting it had been placed there after the first. The tea itself had grown opaque, as though withholding its own confession. I found the port decanter half full on the sideboard, its stopper missing. Someone had poured, then changed their mind. Perhaps Tennant, perhaps not. There were 2 glasses there as well, one still carrying the ghost of a fingerprint, a small smudge shaped like indecision. Behind me, the door creaked. It was Miss Parry, the theology student I'd met in the chapel. She said she couldn't sleep. Neither could I. She asked if I minded her company. I didn't answer, and she took that as permission. She stood beside the table, her eyes tracing the cups. She said she often saw Tennant here, evenings mostly. He liked routine, same seat, same book, same tea, and lately, the same visitor. A woman, she thought, always left before complying, always wore gloves. Gloves. It was a small word, but in Oxford, where gilt dresses in Latin, small words matter. I asked if she had noticed the woman's face. She said no, only that her perfume lingered a faint, old-fashioned scent, like violets bruised in rain. I could almost smell it then, rising from the air itself, that soft floral echo that doesn't quite belong to youth. When she had gone, I remained. The second cup seemed to watch me. I touched the rim and found it cold, though not yet lifeless. Someone had sat here, argued perhaps, or pleaded. Tennant's last paper lay open nearby. The first paragraph discussed time as a moral condition. The second was crossed out entirely. The third began with the words, "All truth demands repetition." Repetition. I remembered the bells, their uneven rhythm, the way they had faltered on the morning of the first death. I looked again at the cups. The pattern on the porcelain was identical, teeny blue fleurs-delis, but one cup was cleaner than the other, less stained by use. It had come from a different set, perhaps borrowed, perhaps brought. That difference was enough. Whoever drank from it did not belong here. The clock struck 2. Its sound lingered in the air, oddly hesitant, as if echoing the bells themselves. I poured what remained of the tea into the sink. The residue clung to the porcelain in dark curls, like handwriting dissolving in water. On the counter beside the sink lay a single sugar cube, untouched, its edges softened by damp. 2 cups, one sweetened, one not. 2 people, neither reconciled. Later, as I left, I paused at the threshold and glanced back. The rain had eased. The 2 cups remained side by side, cooling into silence. In their symmetry, there was something accusatory, as though each waited for the other to admit what had been said before the bells began to ring again. It was a small thing, almost laughably, so the kind of error that would have escaped anyone who wasn't already in the habit of distrusting appearances. I'd been reading over Tennant's timetable again, the one found in his jacket pocket the morning of his death. The handwriting was neat, too neat, as if drafted rather than used. The service circled twice, evensong. Feast of St. Swithin had been written in ink slightly darker than the rest. It wasn't Tennant's hand. The discovery came to me over breakfast, though breakfast is too generous a term. There was a stale roll, a cooling cup of tea, and a crossword. The clue read, "Deception found in devotion." 5. I filled in the word faith before realizing, with a small satisfaction, that the correct answer was fraud. Outside, Oxford had slipped into one of those deceptive calms it wears between storms. The streets glistened faintly, as if polished by regret. I made my way to the Bodleian, where the librarian greeted me with her usual expression of polite resistance. She remembered Tennant, of course. Everyone remembered Tennant now. He'd been in often, reading about campanology, the study of bells, a word that seemed to hang longer in the air than it should have. The librarian said something that caught me off guard. He'd always left 5 minutes before closing. Always. Except, she said, the last time. That evening he had stayed an hour past the chime. She remembered because she'd locked up late and found him still at the table, eyes fixed on a page that wasn't the one he was supposed to be reading. When she approached, he closed the book quickly and said he'd mislaid something. He had. His sense of safety, perhaps. I walked back toward St. Swithin's under a sullen sky. The chapel bell struck noon, the sound carrying with that peculiar Oxford melancholy beautiful, but never comforting. Near the gate, Lewis waited, his face drawn into its usual look of weary patience. He told me the pathologist had found something curious. The water in the lungs of the drowned man contained a higher concentration of soot and residue than the Cherwell ever could. Meaning, of course, he hadn't drowned there. He'd been placed. Lewis said it didn't make sense. I told him a few things until one stopped trying to make them. I asked if he remembered the porter's statement about hearing the bells ring twice on the night of Tennant's death. He did, and I asked whether he'd noticed that the clock tower had only one bell. He hadn't. A small inaccuracy, yes, but one that refused to behave like coincidence. In the porter's logbook, which he had shown me days earlier, I found the entry for that same night. Bells rung 9 p.m., it read, and then again 10 p.m., unusual repetition. The handwriting, though, shifted midway through the sentence. 2 hands, 2 tones of ink. The second entry was written by someone unused to the pen, the line trembling slightly to the left. Someone had corrected the record to conceal the fact that the bells had never rung at all. That evening I returned to the senior common room. The 2 cups were gone now, replaced by the false cleanliness of order restored. But the port decanter remained, its stopper back in place, the dust around it disturbed. A faint ring on the sideboard told me it had been moved recently. I thought of the librarian's story, the false handwriting, the uneven bell tower, and the phrase from Tennant's notes, "All truth demands repetition." Perhaps he had discovered a repetition that was not true at all. I poured a little port, out of habit rather than thirst. Its taste was bitterer than memory. Through the window, the first drops of rain began to fall again, soundless against the glass. Oxford does not confess. It merely adjusts its details until the lie fits perfectly. That night, as I lay awake, I kept seeing the word in my crossword. Fraud. 5 letters, beginning and ending in doubt. There are few drinks more treacherous than port. It gives the illusion of gentleness, the color of dusk, the perfume of fruit, but it has the memory of fire. I had taken a bottle from the sideboard in the senior common room that evening, one of the older vintages left from a time when the college still believed in hospitality as a moral duty. Lewis had gone for the night, the rain had returned, and the city outside was dissolving slowly into mist. It seemed an hour made for confession, though I had not expected one. She arrived without knocking. Dr. Celia Harford calm, immaculate, wrapped in a coat the color of unlit ash. She said she had been walking, that the air was too close to think in, and that she saw my light. Her voice had the unhurried precision of someone who had long ago learned to use truth as a matter of rhythm. I offered her a glass. She hesitated, then accepted, though her eyes drifted not to the port, but to the fire. We spoke, at first, of nothing. The weather, The bells that still rang wrong. The way Oxford seemed always on the verge of remembering something it would rather forget. Then she asked if I had ever envied belief. I told her no, though perhaps I had once envied the certainty that belief affords. She smiled at that, a brief curl of the mouth that did not quite touch the eyes. Tennant, she said quietly, had once believed in almost everything. Reason, music, mercy, but not people. That was his failing. He trusted ideas, not intentions. I asked whether she had loved him. The question hung there like a coin suspended in water. After a long moment, she said she had admired him, which, in Oxford, is often the same thing. The port softened her composure. She leaned forward slightly, fingers tracing the rim of the glass as though it were an instrument. She said she had seen him the night before he died. He'd been waiting in the lecture hall, the lights dimmed, the air thick with rain pressing against the windows. He had asked her to meet him there after the last bell. She paused. He wanted to tell me something, she said, something about the letters. But he didn't. He just asked me whether I believed that silence could absolve guilt. I asked what she replied. She said she hadn't answered that she had left him there, mid-thought, because she couldn't bear his certainty anymore. When she turned back to look, he was still sitting in the dark, listening to the bells that weren't ringing. There are moments when truth becomes less important than the shape it takes on the tongue. I asked about the letters again. Her eyes flickered. She said there had been 5, though only 4 were found. The missing one had been written not to Tennant, but by him. It was never posted. He had torn it in half and thrown it into the fire. She had seen the ashes, faintly blue from the ink. Only one phrase remained legible. I have rung the wrong bell. Her hand trembled as she lifted the glass. A drop of port slipped over her knuckle and fell onto the tablecloth, spreading like a slow bruise. I thought of the 2 cups, the false handwriting, the double ringing, and the line from his notes, all truth demands repetition. Perhaps confession did as well. When she rose to leave, she looked almost relieved, though not forgiven. At the door, she turned back and said, "He wanted to change the pattern, you see. The bells were only supposed to ring once." Then she was gone, her footsteps fading down the corridor. I poured the last of the port into my glass, though it had already begun to taste of dust. Outside, the rain had thinned to a whisper, and somewhere beyond the mist the bells of St. Swithin's began again slow, uneven, like a hand uncertain of its own strength. I listened, not for meaning but for error, for that small human inaccuracy that tells you where truth begins to bend. It came, faintly, on the 4th strike. The echo of another bell, one I could not see. There is a certain light in the Bodleian that seems to come not from the lamps, but from the dust itself, a pallid glow, as though the centuries had decided to illuminate their own forgetting. I remember that morning as one remembers a half-formed dream. The sound of footsteps softened by carpet, the smell of bindings, the faint crackle of pages shifting against age. Lewis had gone to speak with the porter again, chasing some bureaucratic ghost about entry logs and duplicate keys. I preferred solitude. There are truths, I've found, that arrive only when no one is waiting to hear them. I'd come back to the desk where Tennant had sat in his final hour at the library. The table was near the north window, beneath a carved arch whose Latin inscription, Tempus fugit, veritas manifelt, at that moment like mockery. Time may flee, but truth does not always stay behind. The librarian had said he was reading about bells, but the volume left on the desk told a different story. A treatise on moral theology, bookmarked at a chapter titled Confession and the Burden of Omission. It was then that I noticed the envelope. It had slipped behind the lower panel of the desk, caught on a ridge of wood. Yellowed slightly, its edge torn by accident rather than intention. No name upon the front, only a faint watermark from the college crest. Inside, a single sheet of paper, folded twice. The ink faded to the color of dried rain. The handwriting was Tennant's. I recognized the slant, elegant, austere, a man writing not to persuade, but to absolve. It began without greeting. To whom the sound will reach, forgive the delay of truth. The next lines were fragmentary, as though written in haste or despair. He spoke of deception, of a bell that rings not for time, but for concealment. He wrote that he had struck it twice, once for duty, once for mercy, and that only one of those peals had been heard. The rest had been silenced. There was mention of a woman, unnamed, and of the phrase change ringing not in its musical sense, but moral. The order of the notes, he said, had been altered, and in that alteration lay the lie. I read it twice before returning it to the envelope. It was not a confession, not entirely. More a puzzle left behind by a man who feared resolution. Lewis returned as I sat staring at the letter. He said the porter's records showed something curious, that the chapel bell had been wound manually that week, not by the usual electric timer, meaning someone had needed to climb the tower. He looked at me for reaction, but I was still thinking about Tennant's words, 2 peals, 1 unheard. I asked Lewis what time the porter's last entry was. He said 9:30. I reminded him the bells had been reported at 9 and 10. The discrepancy, I suggested, was deliberately a small inaccuracy, again as though the city itself had joined the conspiracy. The afternoon wore on. Students drifted between shelves like somnambulists, the rain smudging the view through leaded glass. I walked to the window, folded the letter back into its hiding place, and pressed the wood panel shut. Celia Harford appeared a little after 5. She had not expected to see me, or so her stillness suggested. She said she had come to return a borrowed volume Kierkegaard, The Concept of Dread. I told her dread was rarely returned once borrowed. She smiled thinly and asked whether I'd found what I was looking for. I said not yet, though perhaps I'd stumbled upon something that preferred not to be found. She lingered, as people do when words hover unsaid. Then she mentioned that Tennant had once rung the bells himself, years ago, for a memorial service. It had been a mistake. She said the ropes tangled, the rhythm distorted. But he'd kept ringing anyway, unwilling to stop what he had started. After she left, I thought of the stubborn rhythm, the refusal of silence. The letter's phrases circled back, change ringing, 2 peals, concealment through sound. I began to suspect that what Tennant feared was not death, but to disclose that somewhere, amid Oxford's well-timed bells, a false note had been built into the score. I left the library as evening settled. The courtyard glimmered with thin rain, puddles mirroring the gaslight. Behind me, the great doors closed with a sigh that sounded for a moment almost human. Later in my room, I poured a measure of whiskey and sat by the ease, window. The bells began again, measured, solemn, slightly off-key. I counted. 1, 2, then silence. Perhaps he had been right after all. The second peal was never meant to be heard. It was Lewis who brought the report late in the afternoon, the rain still sliding along the windows of my office like unspoken thoughts. The pathologist's handwriting was as angular as his mind, precise but devoid of curiosity. Cause of death, ingestion of an unknown compound. Probable poisoning. Yet the word probably sat there uneasily, as if even he mistrusted it. Lewis stood awkwardly, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "They think it was arsenic, sir." I told him arsenic was for novels, not Oxford. He didn't smile. I didn't blame him. There's little humor to be found in the mechanics of dying. The deceased, the second man, the one pulled from the river, had indeed ingested something, but the compound wasn't lethal, merely bitter. A tincture, the report said, of belladonna diluted far below harm. Something one might take for nerves, or vanity. A stimulant, not a sentence. the poison that wasn't. That night I walked alone along the High, the city lit in puddles. Oxford always looks its most ancient under rainstone shining like skin, spires blurring into their own reflections. The bells of St. Swithin's were silent for once, and in their silence I heard too much. In the shop front of a chemist near Magdalen Bridge, a small glass bottle caught my eye, its label faintly visible through condensation, Tinctura Belladonnae. Common enough, but behind it, another bottle, unlabeled, held a darker liquid. I asked the proprietor about Tennant. Yes, he said, the doctor had come often, though never for poison. For cough syrup, perhaps. For headache powders. Oxford's mines burn bright, but ache terribly. I left with nothing but the faint smell of camphor clinging to my coat. Still, something in that window stayed with the two bottles side by side. One marked, one not. The symmetry of deceit. Back at St. Swithin's, I sat again in the senior common room where the 2 cups of tea had once waited. The table was cleared now, polished to innocence. Yet when I lifted the saucer nearest the window, I saw a faint ring darker than tea, narrower, the residue of something medicinal. Belladonna, perhaps. Not to kill, but to mimic sickness, to delay suspicion. A performance, not a crime. Lewis returned, his coat dripping onto the floor. He said the missing bicycle had been found abandoned behind the churchyard wall, tires slick with moss. I asked whether he'd noticed the chain. He looked puzzled. I told him the chain would tell him what I already knew, that the bike had not been ridden recently, only placed. The pedals would be dry, but the wheels wet. He stared at me the way he always did when deduction trespassed into poetry. So I told him, whoever moved the body had done so by the river path, not by bicycle. The story of the stolen bike, the supposed escape it, was camouflage, a fiction so ordinary it passed as truth. Later that evening, as the rain thickened into mist, I walked back to the chapel. The door was unlocked. The air inside was cool and faintly metallic, like breath trapped in brass. On the lectern lay the hymn book again, though this time it was closed. I ran my fingers along the edge and felt something rough powder, perhaps, dusted across the binding. Belladonna leaves, dried and crushed, harmless in such a small measure, but symbolic. A warning left for someone who would understand. Celia's voice echoed in memory. He wanted to change the pattern. The bells were only supposed to ring once. I began to wonder whether Tennant's death was less a murder than a correction, one man attempting to amend a moral misprint, another unwilling to let him. Outside, the wind rose, tugging at the ivy along the walls. The city felt newly watchful. In the darkness, the bells of a distant chapel began to stir, not St. Swithin's, but close enough to trick the ear. Their sound was soft, hesitant, as though uncertain which truth to announce. When I returned to my room, I poured a whiskey and stared at the glass until it ceased to tremble. Poison, I thought, was rarely chemical. It was intentional, misread. Love turned to duty, faith turned to pride. And sometimes, as in Tennant's case, the poison wasn't. It was late evening when I returned to the college. The rain had stopped, but its absence felt deceptive, as though the weather had merely withdrawn to listen. St. Swithin's lay in half-light, the kind that makes even certainty seem uncertain. The stone paths glistened, the windows breathed mist, and somewhere far off a bell rang once and thought better of it. Lewis was waiting in my office, his damp coat folded neatly over a chair, a gesture of respect that always felt faintly apologetic. He said the lab results had come back. The liquid found in Tennant's glass contained no poison. None at all. Not even a trace. I asked him what, then, had killed the man. He said the pathologist believed it was cardiac arrest, sudden, natural, convenient. Convenient. That word clung to me. I poured a whiskey and stared at the amber pool as though it might correct the record. A natural death, they called it. And yet nothing about Tennant's last days had felt natural. His lectures unfinished, his notes rewritten, his letters half-burned. Death had not come to him. It had been invited. Lewis asked whether we should close the file. I told him we should wait. Waiting is a form of investigation when one no longer expects the truth to arrive willingly. He nodded, though I could see he disliked the stillness that followed. He was a man of action. I was merely a man of delay. When he left, I took Tennant's notebook from my drawer. The pages were warped from damp, but the ink still spoke. One phrase caught the lamplight. The distinction between antidote and poison is merely dosage. A neat academic observation, yet, as with most truths, it revealed itself backward. I thought again of the second man they won in the river, and of the so-called tincture in his blood. Belladonna, harmless in measure, fatal in belief. It occurred to me then that poison, in Oxford, might operate less through the bloodstream and more through the mind. The suggestion of danger, once planted, can be as lethal as the substance itself. I left my room and walked to the chapel. The door, as ever, was ajar. The air inside was colder than it had any right to be. The candles guttered as I passed, as if reluctant to acknowledge company. At the altar, the hymn book was open again, this time to a different page, Abide with Me. Someone had turned it, perhaps to pray, perhaps to mock the gesture. Celia Harford was there, seated in the front pew. She didn't turn as I approached. She said she knew I'd come. I asked how. She said guilt keeps regular hours. Her voice was steady, her hands folded around a handkerchief she didn't seem to need. She told me she'd seen Tennant the night before he died. He'd been distraught, convinced he'd caused a death, though he wouldn't say whose. She paused then, as if expecting me to absolve her by silence. I didn't. She continued. Tennant had told her about the tincture that he'd given to a student, a young man who'd been threatening to expose him for falsifying research. The drug wasn't poison, only meant to frighten. But the student had panicked, fled, and drowned. The poison that wasn't had become the guilt that was. She said Tennant couldn't live with that. He believed he'd killed the boy, even if the river had done the rest. She told him the tincture was harmless, that the only poison was his conscience, but he didn't listen. The next day, she found him in the chapel, the bells ringing though no one had touched the ropes. Her eyes shone faintly in the candlelight. I asked why she had come tonight. She said she wanted to confess but not be forgiven, that some truths only stay pure when left incomplete. When she had gone, I sat where she'd been. The chapel was utterly still. I thought of Tennant's note about dosage and of the way belief, like poison, depends on measure. Too much truth can be fatal. Too little leaves you untouched but unchanged. The bells outside began again soft, uneven, as if rung by memory rather than hand. I closed my eyes and let them echo through me, those imperfect tones of Oxford. There, I thought, lies the lesson in poison, not that it kills, but that it convinces. There is a peculiar silence that follows the end of a case, not relief, not peace, but a kind of vacancy. The noise of pursuit stops, and in its place remains only the faint hum of one's own thoughts, like an engine that refuses to die even after the key has been turned. Oxford, in its indifference, continues as though nothing has happened. Bells ring, students hurry, the rain resumes its quiet tyranny over the cobblestones. Only those of us who have seen the underside of reason notice that the sound of the city has changed its pitch. Tennant was buried 3 days later. A modest service, attended by fewer people than one might expect for a man whose intellect had once filled halls. Lewis stood beside me, uncomfortable in the way only honest men are when ceremony replaces truth. Celia Harford did not attend. Whether by guilt, Propriety or both? I couldn't say. The choir sang "Abide with Me," and I found myself watching the faces of those who mouthed the words without sound. Grief in Oxford, I've found, is more an etiquette than an emotion. After the service, the porter approached me. He had something to return, a key, dull and tarnished, found in the chapel vestry. "Tenants," he said, though it fit no door in the college. I turned it in my hand. The teeth were oddly worn, as though forced against the wrong lock again and again. A futile gesture of entry. Or exit. Lewis and I walked back through the quadrangle. He asked if I believed Tennant's death had truly been an accident. I told him belief was a luxury I'd long since pawned. He said nothing after that, and we parted beneath the clock tower. It struck the hour a moment later, but the chime faltered an uneven note, too low, as though it remembered its error from before. The sound followed me home. In my room, I opened the window to the smell of wet stone. The evening air carried the faint echo of the river, moving unseen but never absent. On the table lay the case file, the pathologist's report, the letters, those quiet paper ghosts of what people mean but cannot say. I poured a measure of whiskey and began reading the last of Tennant's notes. It was an unfinished essay, philosophical, obscure, and yet deeply human. In every truth there lingers the residue of its opposite, he had written. To tell one's story is to poison the silence that keeps it whole. That, I suppose, was the heart of it. Not murder, not even deceit, but confession. Oxford teaches its scholars how to hide in plain sight, behind syntax, citation, formality. Perhaps Tennant's only mistake was that he believed intellect could atone for instinct. Celia sent me a letter the next day, postmarked from a small village near the coast. The envelope was unsealed, as if she hadn't been sure whether to send it at all. Her handwriting was smaller than I remembered, the lines trembling slightly between ink and restraint. She wrote that she had left her fellowship, that the bells no longer sounded the same, that forgiveness, like sound, diminishes with distance. I read it twice and placed it between the pages of Tennant's notebook, though I doubted either of them would forgive the intrusion. That evening, I walked again by the river. The water moved with its usual pretense of calm, though in its depth it seemed to hold a darker intelligence. The light from the college windows wavered across its surface, fragments of illumination that never met. I thought of Tennant, of the drowned man, of Celia and her careful silences, of Lewis and his unguarded decency. Somewhere behind me, the bells began once more, their tone restored, their rhythm perfect. I stopped and listened, not for what they said, but for what they had ceased to hide. A confession, perhaps, of the city itself that it lives by echo, not by truth. When I returned to my room, I found the key still on my desk. I placed it in a drawer and turned it gently until it clicked shut. The sound was small, final, and inexplicably kind.